Non-DOMs. Yes, the watchword of the Labour Party election campaign back in July last year. Oh, so much was to be paid for by the abolition and loophole closure of the non-DOM tax status. Well, it's all come crumbling down. My name's Tom Harwood and this is the GB News Originals series. Firstly, shall we remind ourselves of what all of the shadow front bench were saying during that election campaign, that election that propelled the Labour Party to one of its largest parliamentary majorities in the party's history. Yes, they were going to pay for oh so much with the simple abolition of this one strange status.
We will not have the big loopholes in the change on the non-DOM taxation policy the government have had. You can't put your foreign assets into trust under Labour and therefore there's more revenue.
Paid for by cracking down on tax avoiders and the non-DOM tax status.
So what's Labour's solution? We would introduce a proper tax on the very super wealthy non-DOMs, and we would use the proceeds from that to fund extra appointments.
Tightening up the rules around non-DOMs, cracking down on tax avoidance to fund those 40,000 additional appointments every single week in our NHS.
Paid for by cracking down on tax avoidance and non-DOMs.
The only tax changes that we're setting out at this election are the tax loophole changes that we have already set out on private schools, on private equity, on non-DOMs.
We'll pay for that by getting rid of the non-DOM status completely. That's the special tax status for the super rich.
We'd pay for that by cancelling this ridiculous loophole for non-DOMs so that they pay so much less tax than everybody else. We need government to get a grip.
Us blokes hate talking about a little thinning up top, and many of us settle with that balding look, but that wasn't for me, and that's why I went to Elite Hair, the world's leading hair loss clinic, and now I've had over 4,000 new hairs added to this barnet, and very soon I'm going to be rocking some brand new flowing locks. And you can too! So how does it work? Step 1, I sent the team a set of photos of my head. Step 2, I then spoke to one of the Elite Hair staff who looked through my photo submissions and worked out a treatment plan for me. Step 3, Elite Hair then organised accommodation and the treatment. I was at their state-of-the-art treatment centre in Istanbul, and their incredibly kind staff took me through the process, and before I knew it I was in surgery. Elite Hair and their leading medical experts have specialised in pain-free treatments using the sleep deep method, and they really mean that. I felt incredibly relaxed the whole time and I haven't felt any pain since. Check out Elite Hair using the link in the description. When you do, Elite Hair will provide you with a free personalised hair analysis. Then you'll join over 100,000 happy patients. Hit that link and start your hair growth journey like I did today.
Sounds like a panacea, doesn't it? Sounds amazing. We're just going to squeeze the wealthiest in society as they're avoiding paying tax in the UK. Well now, speaking at Davos, the World Economic Forum, where the Chancellor has spent most of this week, she's announced that she's changing her plans on the non-DOMs. Clearly, the exodus of the super wealthy from the United Kingdom has hit our tax take, because the Labour Party wasn't quite telling the truth when it said the only taxes it would be raising were on things like private schools and non-DOMs. No, normal workers and everyday businesses have seen their taxes rise too. The national insurance contributions have gone up, particularly for those on low wages. And that has meant that some businesses are now cutting jobs, cutting many more jobs than people were expecting. 3,000 jobs going from Sainsbury's, for instance. We're looking at prodigious cuts to particularly low-paid employees. That is a tax rise that the Labour Party did not advertise before the general election. Because everything was supposed to be paid for by this one simple trick. The non-DOMs, yes, those super wealthy millionaires and billionaires, the people who have a special status that means they don't pay any tax at all in the UK. Oh wait, that's not quite true. No, if you're a non-DOM in the UK, the status that used to exist, of course, it meant that you would pay tax on earnings you earned in the UK. But you wouldn't pay tax on earnings you earned outside of the UK. This fact is not well understood. It's why the Labour Party could get away with this populist pledge for a long time. Indeed, the Conservative Chancellor at the previous budget under the previous Parliament, Jeremy Hunt, tried to abolish non-dom status as well because it was such a popular thing to do. Why aren't these rich people paying their fair share? How many people realised, though, that it wasn't about tax paid on money earned in the UK? It was about the UK bizarrely levying tax on earnings from overseas. What right does the United Kingdom have to demand that someone who perhaps came from India and has business interests in India, but then decided to make their life in the United Kingdom and has different business interests in the UK? Why should the UK levy taxes on all of the Indian business that this individual does? Or Americans. Why would an American come over and live in the UK if all of their interests in America were also being taxed by His Majesty's Treasury here in London? It seems that this is a relatively sensible status for those that are hyper-mobile and hyper-wealthy that might have multiple homes across multiple countries and want to localise their tax within the countries where that tax is levied, where that business is done. That was never explained, of course, during the election campaign, and so the Labour Party got in and it began to so-called tighten up this loophole, close what they described as a loophole. But of course it's not a loophole at all. There's a reason why the non-dom status was instituted many years ago. There's a reason why it was kept under Labour and Conservative budgets, well, for decade after decade after decade after decade. There's a reason why Gordon Brown, nor Tony Blair, nor Jim Callanan, nor Harold Wilson, there's a reason why none of these individuals, none of these Labour Prime Ministers got rid of that status. Because it meant that people who had huge businesses, who were the wealthiest and most innovative individuals in the world, could come to the UK, could spend money in the UK, could buy properties in the UK, could bring a lot of cash and employ a lot of people here in the UK. Now they'd pay tax on all of that economic activity that went on in this country. The only tax they wouldn't pay is on economic activity that went on in other countries. It seems like a relatively sensible system, and it's one that was, as I say, in place for decade after decade after decade. Yet now it's gone. And sadly, many of the people who used that system are going too. The millionaire exodus that this country has seen has been just about worse than any other country on the face of the planet. Yes, proportionately worse than the millionaire exodus that China has experienced. Communist China. It's pretty extraordinary that we've ended up in this situation that the Adam Smith Institute, that economic think tank, projects will actually lose hundreds of millions of pounds to the Treasury in the coming years. Yes, as people move their economic activity overseas, as the super wealthy steer away from the United Kingdom, it looks like, far from raising money with this loophole closure, far from raising money with the abolition of non-dom status, brilliantly, the government's actually losing money. Yes, the Treasury looks like it will actually take in less cash. And there we see the screeching U-turn from the Chancellor. This is why, while rubbing shoulders with the global elite at Davos, the Chancellor seems to have changed her tune. She seems to be saying that tweaks will be brought in to mitigate the losses that the abolition of the non-dom status has clearly caused. It's a bit embarrassing for the Chancellor. It's a bit embarrassing for the government. It's a bit embarrassing for the Labour Party, which seemed to say very little in the general election. But one of the things it did say time and time again is that non-dom status would be abolished, those loopholes would be closed. We're 6 months in to this Labour government and already they've had to. The economic situation has forced them to change tack on precisely what they said they would do during the election. I've lost count of the number of U-turns that this government has now performed. What it said before the election and what it's done after the election seems to have been two very, very different worlds. But we'll be keeping an eye here at GB News on all of those U-turns, on all of those policy decisions that were not announced before the general election. Whether it was taxes on farmers, whether it was that tax rise on employees, the employers' national insurance, the incidence of which, of course, falls mainly on those employees. Or whether it was the implication that we saw from the Labour Party that they would stand with the waspy women, whether it was the implication from the Labour Party that they would stand with the rural communities. Whenever we look at all of these sort of implications and warm words, whether it was towards pensioners, we saw that famous video of the Prime Minister before he was Prime Minister talking about how so many old people struggle between heating or eating in the winter months, only then for the government to remove the winter fuel allowance. None of it seems to add up. None of it seems to be particularly consistent. And we don't even need to look at fiscal measures. It's not just tax and spend. What about HS2? Yes, Keir Starmer, when he was newly elected as a Member of Parliament for Holborn and St Pancras, campaigned against HS2. Now he's saying he criticises the last government for cutting it and that he wants to build. Similarly, Keir Starmer criticised all plans to expand Heathrow. He cheered the environmental activists who stopped airport expansion. And now it looks like his government is going to go ahead with that airport expansion. Has this been the most flip-flops in the shortest period of time of any Prime Minister in modern history? Quite possibly. We'll be keeping an eye on all of these flip-flops as the weeks and months progress, and still, it looks like potentially we may see a budget coming sooner rather than later. Rachel Reeves will be delivering a growth speech in the next 14 days. But could there be one of these budgets earlier than was expected? We saw the borrowing figures for December come in at £10 billion more than the last December. That's the highest borrowing figure in any year since COVID for 1 month. Clearly, the country is in a rut. How are we going to get out of it? Well, we keep an eye on that here for you at GB News. So don't forget to subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel for plenty more.